In today's video from Demystifying Proposals, we're going to talk about the staffing plan of the RFP that we broke down the other day. Our staffing plan was subfactor 2. We're going to sort of dive into a little bit more of the details of how we made our outline based on the RFP requirements. So this is the proposal format instructions from section L, or as they call them, the proposal preparation instructions. They are asking for 1-inch margins on all sides, which is pretty standard in federal government proposals, Times New Roman 12 point for text, 10 point for graphics and tables. The RFP doesn't mention actually a font for tables, only for graphics and diagrams. So this is potentially a question we might want to ask to confirm that that applies to tables as well as graphics and diagrams. A lot of times the government thinks of graphics and tables as the same thing. We also might want to ask a question about whether the headers and footers can be in a smaller font to fit in the 1-inch margins, because there's a lot of information, as we'll see later, that needs to go into the headers and footers, and fitting that in a 1-inch margin can be tough. There's also a requirement for a single space between lines. This might be a question we also want to ask to confirm that this instruction just means single space in the paragraph headings. I would ask this question mostly because we believe others may also ask this question, and the way they ask it, we may get an answer we don't want. Portrait orientation is required. Again, that's fairly standard for a federal government proposal. Company name, RFP number, contract, page number of numbers of pages is required in the footer. So as I said, that's a lot of information to fit into a 1-inch margin footer at 12 point Times New Roman. So these are the section L technical volume content instructions. As you can see, there are 5 subsections: technical approach, staffing plan, management plan, similar experience, and 508 compliance. This video is going to be talking about the staffing plan part of that of those content. So these are the section M technical volume instructions from a high level. As you can see, the 5 subfactors are the same as what we found in section L. So that's good. We always like it when sections L and M match. So staffing plan is what we're going to be talking about in this particular video. The other thing to note is that the technical factors are listed in descending order of importance. So technical volume is the most important. Staffing plan would be second most important, followed by management plan, similar experience, and 508 compliance. So that will come into play when we do our page allocation for our outline. So with our high level information from section L and section M, we can create our level 1 headings for our outline. The technical approach is section 1 of the outline, and here we have the L and M references in the heading. So section L1 and section M subfactor 1. The L references are actually not numbered, so I just use the same numbering system as they used for section M, just to make it easier for reference purposes. It's a personal choice. You could just use section L here and not have the number behind it, but it makes it easier in my mind for them to know that when you're talking about section L2, you're talking about the staffing plan. So in this screenshot, you can see the 5 level 1 headings: technical approach, staffing plan, management plan, similar experience, 508 compliance. So we have all of our level 1 headings now complete in our outline. And now we just have to fill in the rest. Note that there's a dummy heading 2 and heading 3 in our outline. So that's what's there. We'll fill those in now. So there are more detailed instructions in both L and M about what the technical volume sections should include. So now we're going to add those proposal instructions from section L in the table that precedes each proposal section for that content. And then we're going to add the section M instructions as well. And then we use those details to construct the outline for the rest of each subsection. So here for the staffing plan, we have 4 subsections, A, B, C, and D. Note that there is content before section A, so we want to make sure that we address that information somewhere as well. We'll talk about that on the next slide. And references made to the key personnel and providing references for the key personnel. However, nowhere in the RFP does it mention which roles are considered key. So that might be another question that we want to ask. Or we can just make some assumptions based on our firm fixed price pricing as to which roles we're going to make key. Since they don't tell us which roles are key, we can decide for ourselves. And then the evaluation criteria is here as well in the second box. And there's not a whole lot of detail here other than they are requiring a small business subcontracting plan. And that usually is something that goes in the pricing volume. So again, that might be a question that we ask about where exactly they want that small business subcontracting plan because of our page limitations in the technical volume. And of course, there's no page limitations in the cost volume, as is often the case. So if we can, we'd prefer to provide the small business subcontracting plan either in an appendix to the technical volume or in the cost volume. So I said I said a lot of this on the previous slide. So the requirement is broken down into 4 component parts, A, B, C, D. There is language before those subsections that has to be addressed in the subsections, and I would say it fits into subsection A. Note the subfactor designation in the text of section M doesn't match the subfactor designation at the top of section M. So there's a list at the beginning of section M of what your 5 subfactors are. And then there's the actual descriptions in of what goes into each section and how they're going to be evaluated in section M. And it changes from subfactor 2 to subfactor 3 in that description. Somebody will probably ask a question about that, but to us, again, this is a bit of a gotcha. Since the order in the top of section M matches the order in the top of section L, I don't think I would ask a question about this, but if you want to, it's a question you can ask. As we mentioned in our video on technical approach, once again, in this section, we put in the subfactors A, B, and C into our outline. We put in shortened headers that show the evaluators where they can find the content for each subheading under section L. Note that we added the section L subsections to the bracketed RFP references as L2A, L2B, L2C, L2D to stand for the staffing plan subfactor 2. Section M requirements, again, as we talked about on the previous slide, they mentioned a small business subcontracting plan. That might be something we want to ask a question about because that usually goes in a cost volume. And then each of the 4 components also has subsections, but given the page limits, I don't think I would put in another level of heading, numbered heading. I would just use running headings for those. That will save you some space. And then several of the requirements also might lend themselves to appendices rather than a full text in the document. Again, those might be questions that you want to ask, but resumes are usually an appendix. Draft subcontracting agreements would presumably be an appendix. Service level agreements would presumably be an appendix. So it might be worth asking some questions about those components of the staffing plan that are required. And then we also advise on all of our outlining and our proposal development content that you need to keep in mind the contract type found in section B. We have some specific trainings about how the technical approach and staffing should be different depending on the type of the contract. In this case, most of the tasks are firm fixed price, with only task 5 being cost reimbursable. So think about that as you're putting together your staffing plan content because it should reflect the contract type found in section B. So we have 2, again, subfactor 2 is the heading number 2. You always want those things to align with L and M to the best you can. And since it's the second requirement in L and the second subfactor in M, having it be the second section, number 2, that's all good. You want again, make things as easy for the evaluators to figure out where you're answering their requirements, and numbering things the same is a very good thing. Section 2.1 is the staffing matrix. Note that we put section L2A here. Approach to obtain or replace qualified staffing resources is the second factor, L2B. Project director decision-making authority is L2C. And then subcontractor qualifications is L2D. Now that's a requirement that's quote unquote optional if you don't have subcontractors, but I would still put it in your outline. And if you don't have subcontractors, you could just put in there are no subcontractors and have it be a really simple response. So as we talked about on previous slides, this is the section B CLIN structure. All of the tasks except for task 5 are firm fixed price. So that affects how we're going to write our staffing plan because firm fixed price contracts are usually driven by deliverables. So, but you're going to also want to talk about, you're required to talk about, as we discussed in the outline previously, your staff. And so you're going to need to relate your staff to the deliverables to show that that connection is strong because this is a firm fixed price contract. Also, there is some confusion about whether this is actually a statement of work or a performance work statement. So there's a performance matrix that's included in the RFP as well as the deliverables. So again, that's something that you definitely want to make sure that you're addressing in your response to the staffing plan. Who's responsible for making sure that you're going to meet those requirements of the performance matrix? It's probably the project director, but you just need to make reference to that in your staffing plan section as well. So section C3 lists the contract support hours. And this will obviously be super useful or required when you're doing your pricing, but it also affects our staffing plan because this is the only section of the RFP that has any references to hours to be worked, but it doesn't include labor categories. And there are no instructions anywhere in the RFP about labor categories. But you need to think about as you're building your pricing, what labor categories do you need for the tasks? How many hours each of those people is going to be working, which is obviously a factor in your pricing, but also you're going to need to address that in your staffing plan as well, because you need to explain why you need those people for the particular tasks. So the last step in outlining is actually one of the toughest things to do, and that's adding the page limits to the headings. So overall, this RFP limits the technical volume to 20 pages. All 5 of those subfactors are limited to 20 pages. And also a reminder that we have several questions to ask that would hopefully make a lot of those requirements go into appendices. And so then we would be able to just put in a simple reference to that appendix with maybe a sentence or two to describe what's going to be in the appendix. But you do want to, for the authors, provide that guidance about how many pages you think each of the sections and subsections should include. And you should explain that the subsection page limits are inclusive of the overall page limit. So if you assign, say, 10 pages to the technical approach, then break down that 10 pages for each of the subsections, but explain that that doesn't mean that you have 10 pages to write an intro and then 2 pages for each of the subsections under it. No, it's each of those subsections is part of the overall 10 pages. You would think that would be kind of a gotcha for the authors, but I've actually had authors be confused by that. So it's just something that I would explain to them when I give them the outline, explain it in the stand-up or the outline meeting or whatever whenever you present the outline to the authors. And then also, given that section M says that the subfactors are listed in descending order of importance, that means that subfactor 1 is the most important, subfactor 2 is the next most important. And so I would allocate the most pages to the first couple of subfactors. And then, obviously you want to have page allocations for the other subfactors, but since they're less important, the most important sections should have the most pages. So here we show how the table of contents would look for the page with the page assignments. Subfactor 2 is the second most important, so it gets the next most number of pages after technical approach. So in the case of the staffing plan, we're allocating 5 pages. The staffing matrix, we get 3 of those 5 pages. The approach to obtain and or replace qualified staffing resources would take one page of those 5 pages. Project director decision-making authority would take a half a page of those 5 pages, and um, subcontractor qualifications would take a half a page. As we mentioned, the subcontractor qualifications is an optional section. So if you don't have subcontractors, you can allocate more pages for some of the other sections. Um, because that would be just like a sentence. So depending on how you, whether you have subcontractors or not, you could reallocate these page allocations. But this is how I did it: 3, 1, a half, which adds up to 5, which is the total staffing plan number of pages. So I hope that was helpful in breaking down the RFP and showing how an outline would be developed for the staffing plan subfactor 2 of the RFP. We wanted to dive into a little bit more details in this from what we did in our RFP to outline video. And so this is just a little bit more detail. A lot of the slides are very similar, but there's a little bit more detail as it relates to the staffing plan in this video. Note that there is another video also on technical approach that does the same kind of thing to dive into the details of the technical approach section as well. Thank you for your time.